Great. Hi, my name is Philip James. Welcome to The Elephant and the Serpent. Lamentablemente, esta charla no está en español. Mi español no está tan bueno. Si quieres ayudarme a practicar y hablar sobre el vino, encuéntrame después de la charla. This talk is going to be about Mastodon, an open source federated social network, and Python, the community wrapped around a programming language that brings us all here today. Before we get started, who am I? Like I said, my name is Philip James, and I'm an engineering manager for multiple teams at Patreon. I've also given a number of talks at various PyCons across the globe. This slide is from the talk I gave last year at PyCon US called All in the Timing. I speak about Python and programming a lot. I speak about programming and technical topics all over the world because I still believe that programming is the closest I'll ever come to doing real magic. I've been programming professionally for over a decade, and I still find it somewhat magical to be able to create something useful out of bits and bytes and rocks that we've tricked into thinking by shoving lightning into them. Now, some people in technology have trouble with the word magic. When I say magic, I mean something magical in its effect, not necessarily in its cause. The power that technology brings to the world is magical. The communities that technology helps foster are magical. Even though we can explain every step that happens, every bit and byte and circuit, it is magical to the people who use it and still magical to me. And while I wouldn't call myself an expert on the subject of magic, I know more about stage magic than most. That there is my username across the vast majority of the internet, and I bet there are people in this room who have seen that name flit across their screen and didn't know who was on the other end of that name until right now. Hello, I'm Fildini. But before Fildini was my internet handle, it was my stage name. I spent my early teenage years making pocket money by performing as the Great Fildini at birthday parties all over California. The feeling I got then when I was able to pull off a trick is very similar to the feeling I get now when making a piece of technology do what I want it to do. Of course, that string is also instantly recognizable as a Twitter username. Twitter is magic. The communities that Twitter fosters, communities that many of us in this room take part in on a daily basis, are magical. Through Twitter, we make connections that help us find work, or chat with our peers, or share our favorite activities, or even find love. Twitter is also magic from an engineering perspective. It operates on a scale that many of us in this room have trouble fathoming, and it mostly just works. The magic that exists in programming exists double in systems engineering, and large amounts of it are performed at Twitter on a regular basis. Twitter is also black magic, dark magic, magic that destroys rather than creating. It's a place where the most misguided among us feel free to express every negative opinion, where we are constantly inundated with reminders of violence or targeted with violence ourselves, where it seems like the political bombs are always going off, where it feels like we have to wade through toxic waste to get to the parts that we like. And all of this happens in a set of systems that are currently using our data, our connections and thoughts and ideas, to aggregate ourselves and sell us off to advertisers. And this is because there's a misalignment of incentives with large social networks that I think cannot easily be resolved. The people running those social networks want to make money for their work, which is completely fair. Most of the people using those social networks don't want to pay for them, but do want a place to form communities where all their friends already live. There is still a mental model amongst most internet users that the internet is free, and it's hard to blame them. We in the industry of making the internet haven't done enough to educate users otherwise. The piece of black magic that tries to bridge these incentives is advertising. I don't necessarily believe that all advertising is inherently evil, but I do think that advertising at the scale necessary to fund something like Twitter forces compromises that are hard to align with the average user's incentives, and which promote either a blind eye towards dark magic or a willful encouragement of the dark magic I was just talking about. Towards the end of 2016, for various reasons, I was deeply despairing about all social networks, Twitter especially, and I thought we were never going to get anything better. I didn't think there was a way to build a global community online without funding it through ads. In early 2017, I discovered Mastodon. Mastodon is magic. Mastodon is an open source social networking platform based on a set of technologies that are being adopted as open standards for building social networks. Mastodon solves some of the problems of modern social networks by not having any single server. Instead, anyone can create a server, and that server can federate with any other server on the network. Imagine anyone could start their own Twitter server, and you could join that server, but follow and be followed by people on any other server on the network. Because there's no central service making money from this, there's no tracking of user data, no ads engine trying to collect data, and each user and server admin has control over what they see and who they interact with. It looks like this. This is the main Mastodon Web Interface. If you think it looks like an older era tweet deck, you're not wrong. I know this text is small and there's a lot going on here. I'm going to try to quickly explain what's going on column by column, and you can also ask me questions afterwards or explore it yourself. Also, anywhere I've blurred things out, it's because I didn't feel I had permission to make them public to the world through this talk. This is the main compose bar. Here you can access your account settings, search hashtags and users, and compose toots. The standard way to describe a status update in Mastodon is toot, mainly because that's what the main button in the software says, but we'll be using toot and status pretty interchangeably in this talk. Default Mastodon lets users send 500-character status updates. Users can, of course, include emoji in their toots, including per-server custom emoji that still get rendered correctly across servers. There's a robust community of creating and sharing custom emoji across servers. Toots can have polls, and you can set a visibility and content warning for each of your toots. Content warnings deserve special mention. If you think your toot needs a trigger warning or is a spoiler for some pop media, you can hide it behind some text, and users have to choose to see it rather than being confronted with it. Content warnings and toot visibility make an attempt to solve the problems outlined in this XKCD, which you don't have to attempt to read or memorize right now. I'll post all the slides later. You can set your toots to be public, unlisted, or followers only. Public is what it says on the tin. Unlisted is public but won't show up in the federated or local timelines. And followers only is exactly that. It is only available to your followers. Speaking of followers, this is the home column. This is all the toots from all the people you follow. You can do all the things you might expect from a social network, like replying, boosting, and liking. The local timeline shown here is all the public, non-reply toots from people on the same server as you. If the internet is a superhighway, this is the local cul-de-sac, the little neighborhood that you live in. What's being talked about on the local timeline is one of the best ways to judge the community you've joined on the local server. Here we can also see an example of marking images with a content warning so that users can choose to see them rather than being confronted with them. The federated timeline is one of the most interesting things about Mastodon. It's the superhighway. This timeline is all the public toots your server knows about. If it gets federated to your server and is public visibility, it'll end up here, and it's an incredible way to discover new people to follow and see what the Fediverse as a whole is talking about. So I've said federation a whole lot, but I haven't really explained it. To give us all a grasp of what's going on, I'm going to talk about one of the open protocols that powers Mastodon. Mastodon is powered by a technology called ActivityPub, which is currently a recommendation to the W3C. ActivityPub is a decentralized social networking protocol, and it powers the vast majority of universe of federated social networking sites, collectively known as the Fediverse. ActivityPub specifies two main pieces, a server-to-server federation protocol and a client-to-server protocol. To understand Mastodon under the hood, you need to understand ActivityPub, and I'm going to explain ActivityPub with two of the most famous users in computing history, Alice and Bob. This is Alice. Alice is a user which ActivityPub calls an actor. Alice, according to ActivityPub, has an inbox and an outbox. The inbox receives messages from the rest of the world, and the outbox is where Alice puts messages she wants to send to the rest of the world. Alice's inbox and outbox live in a server, in this case, mastodon.social. Alice's full username in the Fediverse is @alice@mastodon.social. If this sounds like an email address, you're not wrong, because it's very similar to how email operates with multiple servers. Her client makes API requests against the server to take actions, like getting new messages from the inbox and posting messages she wants to send to her outbox. This is the client-to-server protocol. If Alice wants to send a message to bob@mastodon.social, she posts a message to her outbox, which mastodon.social posts to Bob's inbox, which Bob then gets with his client and reads. If Bob is on a completely different server, then this works the same way. Mastodon.social knows how to look up Bob on a different server, and Mastodon.social will post the message to bob@other.server's inbox. This is the server-to-server protocol part of ActivityPub, and in many ways it really is that simple. I'm simplifying somewhat, but not that much. This server-to-server protocol is the beating heart of federation. Every user has a home server, and all the servers know how to talk to each other by posting to the right inboxes for the right users. Those of you who have worked with networks probably already understand this, but one of the benefits of federation like this is resiliency to any one node in the network going down. This has in fact happened in the past to the largest English-speaking server, Mastodon.social. Mastodon.social has gone down hard for hours, and the rest of the network of servers kept humming along, sharing messages and keeping the network alive. When Mastodon.social came back up, the other servers attempted to replay messages back to the right users' inboxes, and the Fediverse rolled happily along. Now, yes, messages can get dropped, but the software is smart enough to try really hard not to let that happen. This idea also applies to server-to-server moderation. If one server in the Fediverse decides to become a hotbed for trolls or Nazis, the admins of other servers can choose to blacklist that node and prevent that garbage from entering their users' feeds. I want to say another word here about the magic of communities. Magical communities require community norms. In the modern vocabulary, this means the communities we belong to have codes of conduct, rules for how we should behave, and procedures that get followed if we break those rules. It's interesting to note that it's only with the rise of sites like Twitter and Facebook that this has been seen as hotly contested or strange. Back in the days of IRC or web forums, and who here used early web forums or early IRC? Seeing some hands? Yes, great. The admins and operators of those spaces had the power to enforce community norms through silencing and banning. Often this was at the whims of the admin, and I would argue that explicit codes of conduct are better. A code of conduct makes it clear what is expected of the admins as well as of the community members. One of the cool things about Mastodon is that admins on servers can mute or block entire remote servers, as well as the people on those remote servers from interacting with the users of their server. An admin can enforce what happens on their server, even if the users involved are on a remote server. This helps make magical communities. Admins can work with the users they're supporting to make sure the place they're building together is what everyone is looking for in an internet home. Okay, so we have message sending, we have a federated network of servers, but we're not quite a social network yet. To power a true social network, we need one more thing, the ability to follow others and be followed. ActivityPub has a solution for this, a follower and following collection. Let's explain with an example. Bob wants to follow Alice. He, via his server, posts a follow action to Alice's inbox. Alice's server receives the message and adds Bob to Alice's follower collection. Now, when Alice posts a message to her followers, Bob is on that list, and Alice's server will post the message to Bob's inbox. Congrats! You now know most of what you need to know to understand how Mastodon and the whole Fediverse operate and how all the servers connect to each other. If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the ActivityPub Rocks site and read the W3C spec. It's deliberately a simple protocol with a lot of power, and beyond powering Twitter-like sites like Mastodon, the open source community is building alternatives to YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. And the cool thing is, because they're ActivityPub powered, someone's Facebook clone account can follow someone's Instagram clone account, and they both interoperate seamlessly. Because there's no central server, every Mastodon server is also a complete set of Mastodon API endpoints. The Mastodon API lets you do basically everything the Mastodon Web Interface lets you do via the API. These two bots here use the Mastodon API and special characters in the Unicode set to make aquariums and space scenes. Bot accounts aren't frowned upon, and there are options in the account settings on Mastodon to mark an account as a bot account. There are even some servers that are specifically bot-friendly. Botsin.space hosts some pretty neat art bots that are using the Mastodon API on that server to make the whole Fediverse more interesting. So let's prove this by building a bot. What's our bot going to do? It's going to toot random lines from the Zen of Python. It's going to live on that botsin.space server, since that server is so friendly to bots. The first thing we're going to need is an OAuth access token for an account on botsin.space. The Mastodon API uses OAuth authorization to make API requests against protected endpoints, and as a developer you can choose the right scopes you need for the applications or bots you're developing. Fully explaining OAuth is sadly outside the scope of this talk, but I'm happy to chat about how OAuth works if you come find me afterwards. I think OAuth is actually pretty, I really enjoy explaining it because I've done it so often, but I know that's a tricky topic for some, so if you're confused about it, please come find me. The Patreon API, which I work on, is also protected by OAuth, and I help maintain our OAuth integration, and I can't wait to chat with you about it. But we still need an access token, so let's get one from botsin.space. We're going to start by going into our settings for our botsin.space account, clicking Development, and clicking New Application. Oh, I hope the video is playing. Yeah, videos. Not a video, I'm doing this live. Our application needs a name and a website and some scopes to give us the right access. Since we're going to be the only ones using this app, the default scopes are fine. Once the app is created, we need the access token that's auto-generated for us. It's that long hex string that we're copying here. Shortly. Sorry, I forgot to move the mouse. Okay. Note that there's no approval process here. You just make apps on servers and start using them. With our access token, we can now make requests against the Mastodon API at botsin.space. Whenever I'm building a bot, I like to test things in the Python shell first so I can play around and get a feel for what I'm doing. As we build our bot, we're going to do the same thing using the Python requests library. Let me just fire up a Python 3 shell real quick. Okay, I'm firing up my shell and importing requests. Then I'm making a post request against the botsin.space statuses API with my OAuth access token and a data blob saying what I want the status text to be. The response came back okay, so I should have successfully posted to botsin.space. And it turns out I did. I love using the requests library when I'm playing with APIs because I get to get a feel for what goes into an API and what kind of responses come out. But when I'm ready to start building an app, I normally look for a client library for the API I want to use. It turns out there is a Python client library for Mastodon called Mastodon.py. Mastodon.py is a community-maintained Python library for Mastodon that supports a large set of features in the Mastodon API. Let's do what we just did in requests in Mastodon.py. So first, I'm going to install Mastodon.py. It's going to install a lot of side packages. I'm going to open a Python shell, and from Mastodon, import Mastodon.py. Then create an instance of the API class with my access token. And the base URL. Because every Mastodon instance is its own set of API servers, you need to tell the client, hey, this is the server that I want to issue API requests to. OK, so now that I have successfully made this toot, let's use the web browser module to open the response that I got back from the toot of where the toot lives. And there we see it. So after that, we have a toot posted to bots.space. Hooray! But you might be wondering why would you use a client library when requests works just as well. There's a few great reasons to use a client library that I can think of. You should use Mastodon.py or any good client library because that library will almost certainly have tests for the functionality it provides, tests that you don't have to write for your requests-based code. Libraries like Mastodon.py even provide coverage metrics for their tests so you can make better choices about how much you trust the library. The second reason to use a client library is it provides abstractions. A good client library will translate the response from API into Python objects that are easier to use in the rest of your Python code, i.e. translating a JSON response into a Python object. As a result of these abstractions, when the API changes and the library updates with the changes, often you as the developer don't need to worry about it because the abstraction the library provides hasn't changed. Why shouldn't we use a client library? Either because we have special functionality that isn't provided by the library that we want in our app, or we're really worried about lag between the API updating and the library updating. I would say in both of those cases, consider committing a patch or diff to the library before rolling your own. If the patch is accepted, you get all the benefits of using a library and your special case covered. OK, we have an access token. We know how to post toots. Now we need to wire the Zen of Python into our bot. We need to get the Zen of Python as strings, randomly choose one of those strings, and put that string into a toot for our bot. So we're going to import this. Hopefully you've all seen this before. This is the Zen of Python. And then we're going to do some very odd, complicated magic to get strings out of the data store that the Zen of Python is stored in the module, which is stored kind of strangely because to get this nice kind of like print at import. And if everything, yep, there we go. So you see that it's now been subdivided into strings. Awesome. So with that, we can now write our little script to toot a line from the Zen of Python at some sort of interval. I'm using that same trick of doing the join of this.d.get for c and this.s.split to get out all of the strings of the Zen of Python as a list of strings, as an array of strings, creating a Mastodon instance, a Mastodon API instance, and then tooting that random string to the instance. Additionally, I've put if name equals main at the end so that I can call this as a standalone script because that's going to be the easiest way to call it. So now that we have our bot, where do we host it? There's a lot of choices. If you only really want it to toot infrequently when you're just at your laptop, then you can have it running on your laptop plus cron. That's fine. I know lots of bots that do that are basically only running when the user's laptop is open and running. You can do the same thing with a server you own and cron. You can also do Heroku with the Heroku scheduler, and on the completely free tier of Heroku, have it on a regular interval toot something from the Zen of Python. Going in depth into these is outside the scope of this talk, but I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards. Hopefully now I've given you the encouragement to try out Mastodon. But how do you join? Well, the first step is to visit joinmastodon.org and choose a server. Because you can follow more or less anyone on more or less any server, the choice of which server to set up your account on becomes one of which community you want to most closely associate with. Generally speaking, find servers where you feel like you could find a home, that have a good code of conduct, and where the admins feel on top of things. For example, I run a server called The Wandering Shop that accepts all kinds of people, but is focused on people who enjoy or create science fiction and fantasy. If you want to learn more about that server, find me after. Also, you can always try different servers out, have multiple identities, and ask your followers to follow you at a different server. Mastodon even provides some tools for making this easier. And that's basically it. My hope that you'll take away from this talk: find a server, join the community, build a bot, and help make magic on the internet. You can email me at phildini@phildini.net, or you can find me at phildini@Wandering Shop. Forget that line, that's an orphan from a previous talk. Sorry about that.